When HOA Karen installed spike strips on Marcus's driveway to keep the neighborhood safe, she never expected he'd uncover her dark secret and rally the entire community to take her down. The sun was setting over the picturesque suburban neighborhood of Willow Creek, where perfectly manicured lawns and identical beige houses lined the streets. It was the kind of place where everyone waved hello, but secretly kept tabs on each other's business. For Marcus Johnson, a 32-year-old software engineer, and his fiancée, Jasmine, moving into their dream home was supposed to be the start of a new chapter. But little did they know, their neighbor, Karen Whitaker, the self-appointed HOA enforcer, had other plans. Karen was the kind of woman who lived for the rules. She patrolled the neighborhood like a hawk, clipboard in hand, ready to cite anyone for the slightest infraction. Overgrown grass, a misplaced trash can, or even the wrong shade of curtains. From the moment Marcus and Jasmine moved in, Karen had made it clear she wasn't thrilled about their presence. Whether it was their loud laughter during barbecues or Marcus's sleek black Mustang parked in the driveway, Karen always found something to complain about. One Saturday morning, Marcus stepped outside to find something shocking. A set of spike strips had been installed at the edge of his driveway. His heart raced as he inspected the sharp metal contraption. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, his voice tinged with anger. He immediately called Jasmine outside, and together they confronted Karen, who was conveniently watering her roses across the street. "Karen, did you put these spike strips on our driveway?" Marcus demanded, trying to keep his cool. Karen smirked, adjusting her oversized sunglasses. "Oh, those? They're for safety. You know, to prevent reckless driving in the neighborhood. Your car is so loud, Marcus. It's a disturbance." Marcus clenched his fists. "You can't just install something like this without permission. This is private property." Karen shrugged. "Take it up with the HOA. I'm just looking out for the community." As Marcus and Jasmine walked back to their house, they couldn't shake the feeling that Karen's actions were more than just about noise complaints. There was something deeper, something uglier at play. Determined to get to the bottom of Karen's vendetta, Marcus decided to do some digging. He started by reviewing the HOA bylaws and discovered that installing spike strips on private property was not only against the rules, but also illegal. Armed with this information, he filed a formal complaint with the HOA board. But Karen, who happened to be the board's vice president, dismissed his concerns with a wave of her hand. Frustrated but not defeated, Marcus turned to the internet. He stumbled upon a local community forum where residents vented about their HOA experiences. To his surprise, he found multiple posts about Karen, stories of her targeting Black and minority families in the neighborhood, using petty rules to make their lives miserable. One post even mentioned a lawsuit that had been settled out of court after Karen accused a Latino family of lowering property values with their cultural decorations. Marcus's blood boiled as he read the stories. It was clear that Karen's actions weren't just about enforcing rules. They were about maintaining control and excluding anyone who didn't fit her idea of the perfect neighborhood. Marcus knew he couldn't let Karen's actions go unchallenged. The spike strips on his driveway were more than just a nuisance. They were a blatant act of aggression, and he was determined to expose the truth behind Karen's motives. But he also knew he couldn't do it alone. If Karen had been targeting other families in the neighborhood, as the online forum suggested, then there was strength in numbers. It was time to bring the community together. Marcus started by reaching out to a few neighbors he trusted. He knocked on doors, introduced himself, and shared his story. At first, many were hesitant to talk. Karen had a reputation for retaliation, and no one wanted to risk becoming her next target. But as Marcus listened patiently and assured them of his support, the walls began to come down. One neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, broke down in tears as she recounted how Karen had called the police on her teenage son for playing basketball in their own driveway. She said he was being too loud and disruptive, Mrs. Rodriguez said, her voice trembling. But we all know it was because of the color of his skin. Another neighbor, Mr. Patel, shared how Karen had fined him for having a too colorful garden. She said it didn't fit the aesthetic of the neighborhood, he explained, shaking his head. But my flowers are a part of my culture. They remind me of home. Each story was more infuriating than the last, and Marcus realized that Karen's reign of terror had been going on for years. She had been using the HOA as a weapon to intimidate and exclude anyone who didn't fit her narrow vision of what the neighborhood should be. As more neighbors opened up, Marcus began to see a pattern. Karen's targets were almost exclusively families of color, or those who didn't conform to her idea of perfection. It was clear that her actions weren't just about enforcing rules. They were about maintaining control and preserving a homogeneous, exclusionary community. Marcus knew that if they were going to stop Karen, they needed to stand together. He organized a neighborhood meeting at his house, inviting everyone who had been affected by Karen's behavior. The turnout was overwhelming. People came with their stories, their frustrations, and their fears. Marcus stood in front of the group, his voice steady but passionate. "We've all been silent for too long," he said, "but if we come together, we can hold Karen accountable and make sure this never happens again." The room buzzed with energy as neighbors began to brainstorm ideas. Some suggested filing a collective complaint with the HOA board, while others talked about reaching out to local media or even taking legal action. For the first time, people felt empowered to speak up, knowing they weren't alone. This meeting marked a turning point in the fight against Karen's tyranny. What started as one man's battle against a petty neighbor had grown into a movement for justice and equality. Marcus and his neighbors were no longer willing to tolerate Karen's discrimination. They were ready to take a stand, and they weren't backing down. The night of the HOA meeting arrived, and the community center was packed to capacity. Every chair was filled, and people lined the walls, their faces a mix of determination and nervous anticipation. Marcus, Jasmine, and a group of neighbors who had been targeted by Karen sat together near the front, their presence a silent but powerful statement. The air was thick with tension as the board members took their seats at the front of the room. Karen, as usual, sat front and center, her clipboard in hand, and a look of thinly veiled disdain on her face. She clearly hadn't anticipated the turnout or the unity of her neighbors. When the meeting was called to order, the board president, a middle-aged man named Greg, opened with the usual formalities. But it wasn't long before Marcus raised his hand and stood to speak. All eyes turned to him as he walked to the microphone, his posture confident and his voice steady. "My name is Marcus Johnson," he began, "and I'm here tonight to address a serious issue that's been plaguing this neighborhood for far too long." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "Karen Whitaker has been using her position on this board to harass, intimidate, and discriminate against families in this community, specifically families of color and those who don't fit her narrow idea of what this neighborhood should be." Karen's face flushed red, and she opened her mouth to interrupt. But Greg held up a hand to silence her. "Let him speak," he said firmly. Marcus went on to detail the spike strip incident, showing photos of the dangerous contraption Karen had installed on his driveway without permission. He then introduced Mrs. Rodriguez, who tearfully recounted how Karen had called the police on her son for playing basketball. Next, Mr. Patel stepped forward, holding up a photo of his vibrant garden and explaining how Karen had fined him for disrupting the neighborhood aesthetic. One by one, neighbors stood up to share their stories, their voices growing louder and more impassioned with each testimony. Karen tried to defend herself, claiming she was only enforcing the rules for the greater good of the community. But her excuses fell flat in the face of the overwhelming evidence against her. The room erupted in murmurs of agreement as more people spoke out, some even revealing how Karen had threatened them with fines or legal action if they didn't comply with her demands. By the end of the meeting, the board had no choice but to take action. Greg, visibly shaken by the revelations, addressed the room. "This behavior is unacceptable," he said. "As a board, we have a responsibility to ensure that this neighborhood is a safe and welcoming place for everyone." Effective immediately, Karen Whitaker is removed from her position on the HOA board, and we will be implementing new policies to prevent discrimination and abuse of power. The room erupted into applause, but Marcus wasn't done yet. He stepped back up to the microphone, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't just about Karen," he said. "It's about making sure no one else ever has to go through what we've been through. We need transparency, accountability, and a commitment to fairness from this board moving forward." The board agreed to form a committee to review the HOA's policies and ensure they were being enforced equitably. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt a sense of hope and unity. Karen, meanwhile, sat in stunned silence, her clipboard clutched tightly in her hands. The power she had wielded for so long had been stripped away, and she knew there was no coming back from this. As the meeting adjourned, neighbors approached Marcus to thank him for his courage and leadership. The showdown had been a turning point, not just for Marcus and his family, but for the entire community. They had stood up to injustice and won, and in doing so, they had taken the first step toward building a neighborhood where everyone truly belonged. In the weeks following the explosive HOA meeting, the neighborhood of Willow Creek began to transform. The removal of Karen Whitaker from the board and the implementation of new, fairer policies marked the start of a new chapter for the community. For the first time in years, people felt a sense of freedom and unity, as if a heavy weight had been lifted from their shoulders. Marcus and Jasmine took the lead in fostering this newfound sense of togetherness. They organized a block party to celebrate the neighborhood's resilience and to give everyone a chance to connect in a positive, joyful way. The event was held on a sunny Saturday afternoon, with colorful banners strung between houses, tables laden with food from different cultures, and music filling the air. Children played games in the street, while adults laughed and shared stories. It was a stark contrast to the tension and division that had once defined the neighborhood. Marcus stood at the center of it all, greeting neighbors with a warm smile and a handshake. People approached him to express their gratitude, thanking him for his courage and leadership. "You've changed this place for the better," one neighbor said, clapping him on the back. "We finally feel like we belong here." Even those who had once been hesitant to speak out against Karen now felt emboldened to share their thoughts and ideas for improving the community. The new HOA committee, which included Marcus and several other neighbors, held regular meetings to ensure transparency and fairness. They worked together to address concerns, from improving playgrounds to organizing neighborhood cleanups. The atmosphere was collaborative and inclusive, a far cry from the fear and intimidation that had once ruled the neighborhood. As for Karen, she became a ghost of her former self. Rarely seen outside her house, she kept to herself, her once imposing presence reduced to a mere whisper. Rumors circulated that she was planning to move, unable to face the community she had tried so hard to control. Some neighbors felt a twinge of pity for her, but most agreed that her departure would be for the best. The neighborhood had outgrown her narrow vision, and there was no place for her brand of exclusion and discrimination in their new, vibrant community. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Marcus stood in his driveway looking out at the now spike-strip-free pavement. Jasmine joined him, slipping her hand into his. "We did it," she said softly, a smile playing on her lips. Marcus nodded, his heart swelling with pride. "We did," he replied, "but this is just the beginning. We've shown what's possible when people come together and stand up for what's right." The two of them stood there momentarily, taking in their neighborhood's peaceful sounds. Children laughing, neighbors chatting, the distant hum of a lawnmower. It was a far cry from the tension and hostility that had once defined their street. As they turned inside, Marcus glanced once more at the road, now free of obstacles and open to all. It was a powerful symbol of the progress they had made, a reminder that even in the face of adversity, change was possible. The neighborhood of Willow Creek was no longer just a collection of houses. It was a community, united by shared values and a commitment to fairness, equality, and belonging. And for Marcus, that was the greatest victory of all.